Our subject for this program is a 1985 Countach 5000S.
So I am standing with what is probably the most interesting stories in Lamborghini's sort of Countach history. And that's of a very smart Indian Sikh, a AMG distributor, and then what is considered to be probably one of the most unloved or misunderstood Countach examples, yet most rare Countach examples ever made. This is one of the factory Lamborghini Countach 5000S fuel-injected cars. And these cars are so misunderstood, but I feel like I know so much about these cars because my dad is completely obsessed with them. And this car, I think we're gonna first jump back into time. We're gonna go back into the late 70s, early 80s, when two gentlemen by the name of Jas Rarwala and Trevor Thomas had a company basically to import European cars or gray market cars into the US by converting them to basically meet EPA and DOT standards. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's basically EPA is all the smog, Environmental Protection Agency, and DOT is all the bumpers and side marker lights. So at the time, in 1979, 1980, the Lamborghini Countach and a lot of other European cars were not US road legal. So there's a lot of these different companies all over across the country that were importing these cars. They were adding side marker lights. There's a great story that a very good friend of mine, Mr. Jean-Claude Radte, that actually put propane. He ran a Countach, filled the trunk with a massive propane tank to actually get it to pass EPA standard. There was so many people doing all of these different things. Mr. Rarwala and Trevor Thomas were most famous for the Cannonball Run Countach. They were actually the ones that imported the car from Europe, and they installed that famous front wing as a bumper and the rear bumperette as a rear bumper to pass EPA DOT. Now, at some point in the 1980s, early 1980s, Mr. Jas Rarwala was really trying his best to become the official Lamborghini importer, or Lamborghini North America, Lamborghini USA. In the 80s, he had really figured out a system that would work for the Countach 5000S. And that was a rear bumper add-on, a front bumper add-on, obviously the side marker lights, and he had designed, with Mr. Thomas, a fuel injection system basically using Bosch components that would be installed on the 5000S engine. Now, the 5000S was a side draft carbureted car, so it was basically removing the carburetors, changing the intake, etc., and creating a plenum. Lamborghini loved this idea because obviously the US was a new market, it was an emerging market, it was a big market for Italian supercars and all these different cars of the period. And the story goes that Mr. Rarwala was not sure that Lamborghini would want a Indian Sikh, a gentleman of his descent as Lamborghini North America, Lamborghini USA. So he actually used Mr. Richard Buxbaum to help him get the US distributor. Richard actually took the meetings for him. And if you know a little bit about some of the things that we've done, you know, Richard Buxbaum was the guy who put AMG on the map in North America and AMG on the map in many different ways. So he was AMG Westmont in Chicago. So he helped Jas become the official importer of these cars. And then Jas's designs would later be used to create a factory version of this car. Now, historically, Lamborghini Countach examples with fuel injection have been worth less, especially the cars that were brought over as gray market cars or the cars that were converted. Now, if you really know your stuff and you were really around in the 1980s, you would know that the factory made a handful of factory fuel-injected cars that basically took Jas Rarwala's designs. And these cars have been documented through factory parts manual books and then VIN numbers. So essentially, if you know a little bit about these cars, they all came with the FLA VIN number They were technically 1985 cars, built in 1984, but for 1985 US consumption. And this is one of the cars I'm standing with. Now, it's believed there were a total of 19 cars in factory records that were sent, basically built at the factory and then sent to the USA. So I'm standing with one of the first official factory USA Countaches. Now, this car has a lot of issues, and we'll talk about that shortly. It's one of the worst I've seen in many years, but the foundation is all there and it drives incredible. Now, if you know anything about Countach pricing and Countach market, for years, these cars have struggled to sell. They're misunderstood, and most people don't even know there is a true factory fuel-injected 5000S that was ever made. And I'll give you some of the differences and nuances. Now, the first early cars from the factory actually came out with a cutout in the front bumper and these bumperettes that were installed. These lights were inside the bumper and it was installed like that. And then the rear bumper, if we go to the rear, had a section here similar to the 1986 and later cars, but it had a US rear bumper here. It was a cover over this that was bolted right here. Now, the other difference that the US cars had was they had this actual federal sticker from the Lamborghini factory. And then to pop something up on the screen, they had this factory fuel injected intake. And this was from the factory, from Lamborghini, in the parts manual book. So these are true factory cars. Don't listen to what people say on forums or anything like that. Yes, there were cars that were converted in 1984, 1983, 1982, all these different years, but the 1985 cars were factory cars. There's actually some great photos of these cars being built at the factory that we've discovered over the years. And they also had these US side marker lights that you could see on the side. Now, if you know anything about these cars, they also, at a certain point, which I believe this car came with a different front bumper. They stopped cutting out the front hood and basically came with a different front bumper that had two bumperettes here, and they moved these lights to the bottom.
This car was delivered to the United States fully certified, including the required impact bumpers that have been nicely integrated into the body design.
In 1985, Lamborghini gets these cars basically to pass EPA DOT, and unfortunately, at that point, Lamborghini had signed a new agreement with Joe Nastasi, and he would later become the Lamborghini distributor. And that was the introduction of the 5000 QB, the 4-valve, and the most famous fuel-injected cars. Now, what's so interesting about this car, and what I've spoken to my dad many, many years about, my dad is absolutely in love with these cars. After servicing these cars for many, many years, he really understood the nuances of the early fuel injection system, the Bosch system, and he felt that these could be the most reliable, or were the most reliable Countaches if you knew how to service them. Now, what's so interesting is this is probably the best example of that, and here's what I'll show you why. This car has 71,795 kilometers from new. And when you start this car and run it, it runs so tight. It revs quick, it's got power, and it's ready to go. And this is not the only one that I've seen with these miles. I've seen a ton of these factory fuel-injected 5000S cars with a lot of miles. And, I always joke with my dad, and I said, hey, these cars were always sort of, they were always the lowest price of all Countach examples. And he always argues with me, and he goes, oh, I'll beat your downdrafts. They run, you could sit in traffic all day in these cars and you can drive these all day long. We'll definitely have to see about that. But they're definitely one of the most rare Countach examples ever made. I think completely misunderstood. And definitely, according to this car, they can definitely be driven and driven and driven. Now, in a video we did a few weeks ago, we believe this car was actually used for a few calendar shoots. And the way you can tell that is obviously it's a 5000S. It has the US rear bumpers, the US front bumpers, and it's Rosso on black, the narrow leather interior. Now, how many were produced of the 19? A handful, I think 2 or 3. What's funny is because my dad was so prolific was servicing these cars in the 1980s, his immediate reaction was this Akbar Hussein's car. And he remembers many of the cars. I don't know if it was or not. And we've got to do a little bit more research, and we'll dig into it. Now, this car, these are the original Route OZ factory wheels. Someone has polished them, definitely a period modification. Someone has removed the US rear bumper, someone has removed the US front bumper, and a bunch of little nuances. But what's wild is everything's there. It's missing the correct chef knob, it's missing the original Alpine, but it runs, drives, it does everything right. Hopefully this car will get completely restored back to the way it was original. I think we're gonna even try to find the correct front bumper and rear bumper, and this will make an incredible car for somebody to drive and enjoy. What's so interesting about this car is it was never shown, it was never advertised, it's completely a ghost. And Gabe from our team, actually who's not a Countach expert and doesn't really deal in Countaches, one of his very good friends found this car completely off the radar and was able to purchase it. So it's super cool to have it here. Imagine this is the first factory fuel-injected 5000S that we've ever owned. That just goes to show you how rare these cars are. And I'm really excited to sort of learn a little bit more about these cars and share sort of the history and the knowledge with you guys. Sergio's gonna put a bunch of very cool data. We'll post some very cool historic photos. There was even a Lamborghini brochure. We'll add that of that early front bumper design. So super cool car. I'm super excited to share the story with you guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I promise you a ton more great content coming soon.